What is the essence of greatness in the kingdom of God? What is the essence of greatness in the kingdom of God? That's the question I want to start us out with. And it's going to introduce the subject that we're discussing today, which this is Class 9, the decline of Rome and the rise of Roman Catholicism. So when you hear Rome, think of the city, the political capital of the Roman Empire. And then the rise of what's known as Roman Catholicism. So I ask, what is the essence of greatness in the kingdom of God? Well, let's go back to the Bible for a moment. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to contrast that with something that was said by someone much later in church history. Well, this is what Mark records in Mark chapter 9. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him, to Jesus, and they said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Then down in verse 41. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him, and he said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." So that is Jesus' explanation of greatness in the kingdom of God. Do y'all follow that? Now let's contrast that with something that happened. Pardon me. Let me mention Philippians 2 as well before we come to this later statement in church history. Philippians 2, the Apostle Paul wrote these words: "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Do you hear the note of utterly thinking about others, thinking about them before yourselves, putting their interests before your own? I mean, that's what's common to Jesus' words and to the Apostle Paul's words as he's talking about Jesus in Philippians chapter 2. Now, with that in mind, in the year 1075, there was a pope by the name of Gregory VII. Before he was pope, his name was Hildebrand. He issued an edict. The Latin title is Dictatus Pepe, which describes the powers of the papal office, the office of the Pope. Now, among the 27 powers and privileges of the Roman Pope are these. Here are 22. The Roman Church was founded solely by God. Only the Pope can rightly be called universal. The Pope alone can depose, that means put out of office, or reinstate bishops. All bishops are below his position, and he can pass sentence of deposition against them. For him alone it is lawful, according to the needs of the time, to make new laws, to assemble together new congregations, and on the other hand, to divide a rich bishopric and unite the poor ones. We've got some seats up front and up here if you want to move forward. Welcome. This next one should really get your attention. All princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone. His name alone shall be spoken in the churches. This is the only name in the world. I think it means the only name of true greatness in the world. Next, it may be permitted to him, to the Pope, to depose emperors. It may be permitted to him to transfer bishops if need be. He has the power to ordain the clerk of any parish he wishes. He who is ordained by the Pope may preside over another church, but may not hold a subordinate position. Such a person may not receive a higher clerical grade from any other bishop. No synod shall be called a general synod without the Pope's order. No chapter and no book shall be considered canonical without his authority. A sentence passed by him may be retracted by no one. He alone may retract it. He himself may be judged by no one. It continues. No one shall dare condemn any person who appeals to the apostolic chair, that is the papacy. The more important cases of every church should be referred to the apostolic see. That, again, is another term for the papacy or the bishop seat in Rome. It's hard to even read this next one. The Roman Church has never erred, nor will it ever err to all eternity, Scripture being witness. By his command and consent, it may be lawful for subordinates to bring accusations. He may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod. And lastly, he who is not at peace with the Roman Church shall not be considered Catholic. Now, how did the church go from the words of Jesus, where Jesus' disciples are vying for position? They're asking Jesus, how is it that we can be in authority over others? Right? Who's going to be the greatest? You or you? I think it's me, not him. I'm higher than you. You're lower. And Jesus just puts all that to rest. And so does the Apostle Paul when he says, look at Jesus. He was God, and yet he made himself nothing and became a servant. And within 1,000 years, look at what the Christian church was claiming for itself, specifically the church that was based out of Rome. So here's our question this morning. As we're answering the question, or as we're looking at this subject, the decline of Rome, the city and the empire, and the rise of Roman Catholicism, this is our question. How did the Pope become the Pope? That's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to focus on this week. Now, near the end of the 4th century, so the late 300s AD, the Roman Catholic Church began a slow but a steady decline. The power of Rome was waning. And eventually the empire was divided into east and west, and the power was gone. Rome was sacked in the year 410 AD by Alaric and the Visigoths. And out of the, we might, to mix my metaphors here, out of the ashes of the Roman Empire emerged a new strength, emerged a new power. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen over a few decades. It happened more like over centuries. But eventually this extraordinarily powerful city and church based out of the city of Rome came into great prominence. So initially, early on in church history, the Bishop of Rome was seen as one among many equal bishops. Now, because Rome is an important city, I think he was seen as like, well, you're somewhat senior, but still you're equal to us. You're not on a higher level or a higher playing field. So how did he go from that to claiming like this to be the supreme pontiff, God's representative over the entire earth, over all of Christianity? Now, let me close out. We're going to jump into that in one second, but let's close out the early church. As you know, for the first 8 weeks, we've been studying the progress of the early church up until the year 451. Who knows what council happened in 451 that definitively answered the question, who is Jesus? And what is Jesus' relationship to the Father? What is his humanity? How does his humanity and his deity relate? What was the name of the council? Chalcedon? Chalcedon, that's exactly right. So as you remember, we kind of started in Acts, and then we went all the way to Chalcedon. That's really the early church period. There's an Anglican bishop, a very good one, by the name of Lancelot Andrewes, who lived in the 1500s. And listen to how he spoke of the unity of the early church, and he used his 5 fingers. And here's what he said. 1 canon, that is all of the canon of Scripture, 2 testaments, 3 creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed, 4 ecumenical councils, and 5 centuries along with the fathers of that period. So according to this 16th century Anglican, that was sort of the way to define what the Christian church was, going back to the first few centuries. 1 canon, 2 testaments, 3 creeds, 4 councils, and 5 centuries. By the way, we discussed the very first ecumenical council, church-wide, all over the world council, which was the Council of Nicaea. And then the next was Constantinople, the first one. There were 4, but Constantinople 1. Then the Council of Ephesus. and then Chalcedon was the Fourth Ecumenical Council. Later on, I'll walk you through the 21 or 22 councils of the church. So, having said that, we're going to kind of close the door on the early church, and now we're going to move into the next major phase of church history, which is known as the medieval church, the medieval period, that runs from Chalcedon all the way to about the year 1500, when the Protestant Reformation broke out. So how did the Pope become the Pope? That's our question this morning. And I've got 3 points. Shocking. No one has ever done that in church history. 3 points. The Pope's rise to power began innocently, it progressed steadily, and it culminated in depravity. That's a strong word, but just wait until we get to the Middle Ages, and you'll understand why I use that word, depravity. Quick explanation of my terminology. The Roman, there are numerous synonyms to allude to the Pope. The Roman Pontiff, that would be one. The bishop's see, S-E-E, that's another way of referring to the official, kind of the throne of the Pope in Rome. The Pope is the man, and the institution is the papacy. Okay, so I'm going to use these words with some freedom this morning, but to give you a heads up there on our terminology. All right, so let's begin with this first point, that the Pope's rise to power began innocently. Contrary to Dan Brown, if you have read the Da Vinci Code, I am unaware of any time where Roman Catholics or where early Christians did this. What's the sound that you make whenever you do the scheming? What is it? Mwah, right? Am I the only person who, when I think of scheming, I think of someone going, mwah? Planning and plotting. There was not a time where that happened. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing, where there were these secret meetings where people weren't, involved and things were hidden. That's how you sell millions of books. So you accuse the Christian church of being that way. But that's just not the case. That's not the case historically. I believe that the Roman Catholic Church came to power innocently at the beginning. Essentially, the early church was, for several centuries, was fighting for its life. And we've talked about some of the fights, haven't we? We looked at the Gnostic crisis. We looked at Marcionism. We looked at Montanism. You had the Donatist schism. You remember that with Augustine that he did battle with? And so think of the mainstream Christians as gradually coming to unity, because they're having to face the opposition of these other groups and other people who are claiming, who are saying, well, you think you're the church. No, we're the real church. The Novatianists, they said that. The Donatists said that. And so over time, there was the church became stronger and more centralized as Christians screened out these heretical groups, and they said, no, we're the church. Okay, so there was sort of some centralizing that happened initially, but it was a good thing. And this is what I mean. The strength of that tight-knit organization was what carried it through the Gnostic crisis and the other crises in the early centuries of the church. So it actually helped the church. It was a needful thing for there to be some gathering and deciding, well, who's in authority over the church. And it was kind of like each threat that was survived, it made the unified Christians stronger. Does that make sense? Okay. Now recall the early marks of unity when you remember the apologists, we talk about them in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the apologists. Recall the marks of unity when the apologists were battling heresies like Marcion, Montanism, and Gnosticism. Remember, the canon of Scripture was the first thing that they used to authenticate, like, yes, you are a Christian. You're one of us. The second was the Apostles' Creed. And the third was the apostolic succession of the bishops. That was initially called the Old Roman symbol. Oh, I'm sorry. That is a big-time typo. That note right here, the Old Roman symbol, that should actually be up here. Okay? Yeah, so the Apostles' Creed was initially called the Old Roman symbol in the late 2nd century. So right here, the third one is the apostolic succession of the bishops. Now, no sooner than you have Christians the mainstream Christians who are kind of gathering in a unified group, it does not take long before they begin to look around among themselves and they ask the question, should we have a spokesperson? Should we have a spokesman for our group? Is there anybody who's willing to take the lead? And there was a good case to be made for Rome. Can you believe a Protestant is saying that? Well, I am. There was a good case to be made for Rome. And eventually, power did accrue to the Roman, to Rome, the city of Rome, as being the center. Now, there's not a biblical case for Rome. There is a practical case for Rome that I think started out innocently, that eventually changed over time. I'll just add right now, there was not unity at all in the belief that the Roman Catholic Church was to be the center of Christendom, or that the Pope was higher than anybody else. That idea did not come along until much later. So let's get to these points. How did it begin innocently enough? Well, the first is that the church in Rome claimed that Peter and Paul died in Rome. Now, in all likelihood, Peter and probably Paul did. But they were later, the Roman Catholic Church claimed, well, because Peter died here and because Paul died here, before Peter died, he actually established the Catholic Church in Rome. Now, that part of the claim is not true, but it is true that in all likelihood, Peter did make it to Rome, and that was where he was executed upside down. You remember we talked about that in John in the sermons just a few weeks ago. But it was not until the mid-4th century, what years would those be? 340, 50, 60, that the church in Rome actually claimed that the center of Christendom should be around the Roman Catholic Church. So it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later that claim first happened. Later, Irenaeus, he claimed, this is important, y'all, if you want to understand the Roman Catholic Church and how the Pope works, the papacy works. The claim was that Peter was the first pope in Rome, right? So they would say he was made pope, and then shortly after he was killed in Rome. And then he handed off the keys of the kingdom to Linus, I believe, was the second pope. And then that pope handed off the authority to the next one, and then to the next one, and then to the next one, and to the next one, all the way to, what's his name today? Pope Francis. That is what's that? Right, yeah. Benedict and now Francis. So that is the claim that the Roman Catholic Church makes, that there's an unbroken chain, a line of authority that has been handed down all of that time. Later, perhaps we'll spend some time talking about, there were all these anti-popes. These are people who claim to be pope. And frankly, what that means is they made like a really big goof. And then later the Catholic Church said, well, he wasn't really the pope. This other guy was the pope. During the Great Schism in the Middle Ages, there were actually 3 popes simultaneously who were all claiming to be the one representative of God on earth. So there are some problems with this. But by the time of Irenaeus, this is an important point, in order to combat these heresies, one of the things they were arguing is that there has been an unbroken chain from the times of the apostles until now. We don't know much about the 12 apostles or the 12 disciples, but we do know, or we're pretty sure, that Peter was killed in Rome. So that's one reason why Rome all of a sudden kind of came to the center stage. Secondly, people naturally look to larger cities for guidance and for leadership. Isn't it the case that even today, if you have First Baptist of Miami and you have First Baptist of Florida City, who is CNN likely going to go and speak with the pastor of, if there's some kind of a serious news event in Miami? Which one? Naturally, right? You go to the pastors in Detroit to get a statement. You don't go to Sheboygan, not usually, right? Okay. What movie is the Sheboygan reference from? Home Alone, of course. Yeah, very good. All right, I'm trying to bring y'all into the whatever century we're in right now. Okay, so that's not insignificant, because this next point, Rome was the only important Christian city in the West. Think about that. Christianity started really in Jerusalem, the day of Pentecost, which was of course in the land of Israel. You had other major cities in the whole of Christendom. Some of the major ones were Alexandria in Egypt. Antioch, which is in kind of the northern part of Israel. You've got Constantinople which later became the capital of the Roman Empire in the east later. So there were no major cities in the west, with one exception, in the city of Rome. That was the one. Now, furthermore, Rome was the center of the empire for hundreds of years. So for hundreds of years, people who lived in this era, people naturally and automatically looked to Rome for help, for guidance, for direction. And so the reality is that people kept looking to Rome. Here's a couple little stories. As the empire gradually collapsed, when Rome was sacked in the year 410, and then when the empire was divided in 476, as I say, people continued to look to Rome for guidance and for leadership. There's a story that there was a town on the Tiber River, and it had some problems with some flooding and some work it needed done on a dam. And the Roman emperor had fled Rome, had gone somewhere else for his safety, and there was a bishop who happened to be local and nearby, and so the Rome roads and public works department had disbanded, and so the bishop did what he could to pitch in and say, all right, well, let's get some people together and we'll fix the dam. Okay, so stories like that you hear about those, and I don't think it was because the bishops were trying to insert themselves and do a power grab. I think they were just trying to help out. So these sorts of things happened a lot. In fact, this is fairly remarkable. In the year 452 A.D., Leo I, Roman Catholics call him Pope Leo I or Leo the Great, he stepped in and he negotiated with the barbarian Attila the Hun. You see, in old books, you're not allowed to call people Huns, but in the old history books, that's what they called them, But Attila the Hun was intent on bringing his horde of barbarians and plundering Rome. And Leo, this bishop, he stands out there and he negotiates with them successfully and actually turned them away from bringing their rage on the city of Rome. So there was some real moral power, if you will, and moral clout and capability that a lot of these people happened. 3 years later, he persuaded a Vandal named Genseric from destroying the city. Now, at Chalcedon, you remember we talked about Chalcedon. Leo was the Roman bishop then. He stated his views, and some who were present at Chalcedon said, Peter has spoken through the mouth of Leo. So all of a sudden, with one acclaim, people are starting to say that you're something special. You're the successor of Peter. Now, this is important. The Bishop of Constantinople vehemently rejected Rome's claim to being the sole universal head of the Christian church at Chalcedon. The Bishop of Rome ignored Canon 28 at Chalcedon. Canon 28 was sort of the deliverance of the Council of Chalcedon. And the Roman church was like, we're going to kind of pretend that isn't in there. Well, that was how they responded to that. Another point that's important, and this happened over the next few hundred years. The East was great. Is everybody awake? Are y'all doing good? Okay. All right. Very good. The East was greatly weakened by the onslaught of Islam in the 7th century. Islam, we'll talk about this next week, actually, the threat of Islam to the now to the medieval church. But it was great. And so Islam was really dominated all the areas of the East. I mean, up to Constantinople later, Alexandria in North Africa, Jerusalem in the year 730, or was it 6 or 735, somewhere in there, Jerusalem was taken over by the Muslims. And as a result of the weakening in the East, what did this leave room for power to grow in? In the West, which we already know was centered in what city? In the city of Rome. That's exactly right. So think of this as within Christianity, the center of gravity is shifting west over the next couple hundred years. Now, most scholars recognize that it was not until Gregory I, he was known as Gregory the Great, he was a pope, that the Bishop of Rome was widely accepted in the West as being more than first among equals and recognized as the head of the worldwide Christian church. Now, Gregory the Great, just as Leo the Great, these men were very capable leaders. They were extraordinarily gifted in whether in charisma or in administrative ability, and so that also helped to strengthen the church. But notice this: Even Gregory the Great, in the years he ruled from in the latter part of the 500s until he died in 604. Even Gregory resisted being called a universal bishop. He wrote these words: "Whoever calls himself universal bishop or desires this title is, by his pride, the precursor to the Antichrist." That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? That's what he said. You heard of Gregorian chants, right? Or however they go, that's from him. That was from Gregory. He wrote Fairest Lord Jesus. You probably know that song. I think he was a very godly man. But even from the Bishop of Rome, there was great uncertainty. He said, "I don't want you to call me universal bishop over the whole church. Don't do it." It's interesting that at the Reformation, John Calvin actually held Gregory up in great esteem. He thought he was a very good man. He said he was the last good pope. So, the last 1,000 years or so, it's been a mess. But Calvin actually respected Gregory the First. Let's see. I'll skip a little bit of this, but I think you're getting the point that the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, it was not necessarily this well-concocted scheme. As I mentioned, the seat of Rome was held by very capable individuals. These are later, Innocent III and Gregory VII, Boniface VIII. We'll come to some of their quotations later. And just think of it this way. If you offer an organization more power and influence, are they going to turn it down? Not ordinarily. Not ordinarily. Yes, Doug?
That was going to be my question. Was there an organized body of believers? I mean, I keep hearing in the first century, which obviously is earlier, there were household groups. Had it organized into something,
yes,
a coalition of congregations or something?
Yes, yes. Yeah, so initially, in the times of the the first century, for example, there were churches in households. We don't know of church buildings. I need to come back and get the year on that. But if you remember in the earlier classes, you remember that there were waves of persecution. And so during these persecutions, church buildings would be leveled, would be destroyed, would be burned to the ground. So until Constantine came and made Christianity the official religion of Rome, no, not true. Until Constantine came and legalized Christianity at the Edict of Milan in 313, it wasn't. You didn't have a lot of churches that were very public. But after that point, that was when church buildings were constructed and things like that. So yeah, that's essentially what happened in the first few centuries. Yes.
Just clarify something. When you say the East,
yes.
which countries are you?
Yes. Okay. Can any of you imagine a map of the Roman Empire? If you're not good at imagining things, it'll be hard. Think of all the way to Great Britain in the west on a map, and then on the east going over to Jerusalem in Israel. So you had some Christianity that spread east, like we believe Thomas went to India. You had some other splinter groups, like the Nestorians who went east and went to China. But when I say east and west, think of the east and west of the Roman Empire. And if you kind of divide it through about Greece, the eastern half, that's the reference there. And in the west would be obviously west of that. Now this is what I would argue. As a result of this lengthy process that happened, over the centuries, the church gradually began to supplant Jesus Christ. Now, the Catholic Church would never admit to that, but I believe that that's what happened. You're getting my prejudiced view as a historian. That is what I believe. That is what I believe happened, and it's a very sad thing. Is it Jesus you need, or is it the church you need? That's a real important question to ask. I know I told the story a couple of years ago about a good friend of mine who I was having a conversation with, and we were talking about something really gross and wicked that had happened about a group of people in this city that we both lived in at one time. And we were kind of shaking our heads saying, wow, people are really depraved. And I'll never forget, he kind of shook his head, and you know what he said? He said, oh, they need the church so bad. And I thought to myself, no, they need Jesus so bad. And like when they have Jesus, when they have him, then they'll come into the church. They'll come into the invisible church, and then they need to get into local membership and things like that. But the church doesn't save anybody. And that's the big error that the Roman Catholic Church turned to over the centuries. Now, do you understand why I've called all these things innocent? I don't think it was a well-planned conspiracy, but this changed. So, secondly, the Pope's rise to power progressed steadily. It progressed steadily. There were notable theologians who began to claim inordinate authority for Rome. This happened over the centuries. The first was a guy called Cyprian. Cyprian lived in these years 200 to 258, and he was the bishop of Carthage. Who else was in Carthage? I'll give you a hint. We talked about him last week. Augustine was. That's right. Augustine was for a period of his life teaching rhetoric. And Cyprian wrote a lot against heresies, and he was seeking a source of authority with which to combat these heretical groups. And he ended up landing on the church and saying the church is the source of authority, mediated through the apostles. That's where the authority initiates. So Cyprian was one of these who argued that authority was not only found in the canon or the Bible, in the creed, but also in the line of succession from the apostles all the way to the 3rd century bishops. Now, other Christian apologists also tried to draw a line from the late 3rd century or early 4th century back to the apostles, and we've already discussed that. So I'll point this out next. This great historian Williston Walker, he wrote that Ignatius knows nothing of an apostolical succession. Yet by the time of Cyprian, he is appealing to this as an established fact. Anyone remember Ignatius of Antioch? We talked about him early. He was the first group of people right after the apostles. He was known as one of the what? Apostolic Fathers. That's right. So he was very early. He wrote in the first and second decade, I believe, of the 2nd century. So about the year 107, 108, 110. Right around in there. So that was completely foreign to the successors of the apostles, but by the time of Cyprian, it was something that people believed. Here's a statement of Cyprian's. You ready? See if you agree with this. No one can have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother. That's a statement from Cyprian. Now, to get a little technical on you, we won't linger, but I would want to press him. What do you mean by the church? You see? If you're talking about the church in terms of the worldwide gathering of all who are trusting Jesus and Jesus alone, and when you are among that group, when you have turned to him in repentance and faith, you are a member of the church, then I agree. But are you talking like the church centered in any city and the church in Rome, as Rome defines it? That's where I personally have an issue with that. The second person who helped with this progress in this direction, unfortunately, is Augustine. Now, I mentioned this a little bit last week, but Augustine said some things like, there is no salvation outside the church. Again, I would want to ask him the same question. Which church? Are you talking about the invisible church? Sure, I agree with that. But the visible church? I'm not going to go along with that. Augustine also said, I would not believe in the gospel if the authority of the Catholic Church had not bid me to do so. I don't want to ruin you by being nuancing everything, but I don't think that this word, well, I know that it didn't have all of the baggage that is attached to it today, right? So let's go easy on Augustine. Think about the things we write and say, and our great-grandchildren will look back on us and be like, can you believe they said that? So we need to be gracious toward Augustine. As I pointed out last week, I said Augustine was very strong on grace, but he was very weak. He was very weak on the church. Now we'll go to the third point because it's our time is running down. This was very significant. Maybe one of the most significant things that happened between the early church and the Renaissance and then the Reformation. It was the crowning of Charlemagne. Charles the Great, Charlemagne. You can hear the words stuck together there. On Christmas Day, the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charles the Great as the Holy Roman Emperor. Notice who is crowning who. Who crowned who? The Pope crowned a ruler, right? A political leader. This act symbolized the Pope's right to crown Christian kings and the emperor's obligation to protect the Roman Catholic Church. Do you see the significance of this? We could, by the way, we could have a whole class on this. We were just having to drive past it. But this is highly, highly significant. Imagine this. Imagine Billy Graham or Rick Warren, whoever you want to say, having to give permission and consent for a president of the United States to take his office. And then the U.S. military makes an oath, swears, gives a vow that they will protect what happens in the church. Does that feel uncomfortable to you? I hope it does. Which, by the way, I can't help but say, we as evangelicals need to be careful when we talk about political involvement, right? Because I think at times we can be like, well, I'm okay with with things getting tied together politically as long as it's going in our direction. We need to be careful about that. We need to be very careful. So anyway, just think through that. By the year 800 and thereafter, the church was ultimately over the state. Now that ended up reversing at a later time, but the Holy Roman Empire, which started in 800, went all the way until the time of Napoleon in the year 1805 or 1806. So 1,000 years, you had this official Christian political state that was a grouping of political bodies in Central Europe. Okay, so let's be circumspect at that point. So here's the summary on this this second point, that from Cyprian in the 3rd century to Augustine in the 4th and 5th century, all the way to the 9th century under Charlemagne, the Pope is now riding high. So do you see the ascent of the Roman Catholic Church coming out of the ashes of Rome? Well, now we turn to the most sad but the juiciest part, okay, is the Pope's rise to power culminated in depravity. It really is sad. I was joking about the use of that word. But during the late Middle Ages, many popes were morally corrupt rotters. I mean, they were horrible people. I mean, it will make your jaw drop when you read some of the things that happen. Many popes had mistresses. They were guilty of nepotism. What's nepotism? Hiring family members, right? They were guilty of simony. All right, who knows what simony is? This is a great word. Anyone know what simony is? Think of the Simon in the book of Acts who wanted money for what? The gift of the Holy Spirit. Simony is paying for church offices. I'm a very wealthy person. I would love for my son, who's morally disgusting, to have the pastorate or the bishop seat in this city. How much will it cost me? That's called simony. By the way, Pope Nicholas III made it into Dante's Inferno. Dante placed him in the 8th circle of hell for his simony. I don't know how Dante got away with that, but he did. He did. The pinnacle of... I have to read this one too. I'm sorry. Pope Alexander VI, who lived right up, Luther was born in 1483, so he lived right up to into Luther's day. Alexander VI was allegedly poisoned. The story is that he invited a cardinal to dinner, intending to poison him, but the cardinal got to the chef first and bribed him and put the cyanide in the Pope's meal. His body was swollen in the coffin in such a way that it appeared that he had died of cyanide poisoning. It was very sad. As a Protestant, that doesn't give me any glee at all. That's horrible. And it's really, really sad that the papacy had turned to that kind of a place. Think of it this way. The pinnacle of the power of the Pope also meant the pinnacle of the Roman Church's opposition to God and His Word. Because this is not what God's Word teaches, in my view. The three greatest popes of the Middle Ages were Gregory VII, Hildebrand, Innocent III, and Boniface VIII. They were, as I said earlier, they were unbelievably capable people. And it's like, if you have a really capable person doing a wicked task, they're going to really do a lot of damage, aren't they? Well, that's what happened by the time we get up into the into the Middle Ages. By the reign of Innocent III, at a council, it was the 12th Ecumenical Council. It's called Lateran IV. It took place in the Lateran Church in Rome. The Roman Catholic Church officially defined the 7 sacraments as being necessary for salvation, and in so doing ceased to be the Christian church. At that point, they had become Roman Catholic. There are so many people who would disagree with me. You are getting my very strongly held opinion and position on this. I'm not being objective here. I'm just telling you my belief that when I put the Bible next to what happened at Lateran IV, I say, if you believe what the Catholic Church teaches, you can't possibly be a Christian because they're teaching something that's completely opposed to the Bible. Okay, so that's my view on the Catholic Church. I've taught on Catholicism before. I did a sermon on it, you remember? And I said then, and I'll say now, I know that there are brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church. I know there are people who are trusting Jesus alone, but they are trusting Jesus alone despite what their church teaches. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? So you can know God and be in the Catholic Church, but not if you actually believe what the Catholic Church teaches. Now, again, that's my view, and I'm willing to discuss it with anybody. So I'm going to now give you the evidence for that, okay? I don't want you to think that I'm some wild-eyed, crazy Protestant. Well, I probably am. But anyway, I'll let you be the judge. What did the Catholic Church teach about salvation in the year 1215 at Lateran IV? Here we go. Lateran IV, Canon 1. There is one universal church of the faithful, outside of which there is absolutely no salvation. He's talking about the institution of the Roman Catholic Church now. Jesus Christ, whose body and blood are truly contained in the sacrament of the altar under the forms of bread and wine, the bread being changed, and then there's the Latin word, what we call transubstantiation, by divine power into the body and the wine into the blood. And this sacrament no one can effect except the priest, who has been duly ordained in accordance with the keys of the church, which Jesus Christ himself gave to the apostles and their successors. Who is necessary for your salvation through taking the Eucharist? Who's necessary? The priest. That's right. He is the one. They would say that in the Mass, I forget the name for it, there's a word for it, when he elevates the host and lifts it up and says the prayer of consecration, it is literally transubstantiated into the real body and blood of Jesus Christ. It still looks like bread. It still tastes like grape juice or wine, but it actually has been transformed in the body of Christ. And then he says this. But the sacrament of baptism, it says, leads to salvation. And should anyone after the reception of baptism have fallen into sin, by true repentance he can always be restored, not only virgins and those practicing chastity, but also one thing for the Pope to say, anyway, I won't go on that, but also those united in marriage through the right faith and through works pleasing to God, and can what? Can merit eternal salvation. So go read all of them. You see the dots. I'm not putting everything in. I'm trying to just put in the salient points. But go read them for yourselves if you want. And it was this sort of thing at Lateran IV under Innocent III that led to some other things that I think are not exactly biblical. Let me give you a couple of examples. Pope Boniface VIII, in 1302, he issued a bull, that is a proclamation called Unum Sanctum. And this is what he said. We declare and pronounce that to be subject to the Pope is for every creature altogether necessary for salvation. This is not changed. Let me just pause here for a second. Y'all, this is not changed. It is necessary for you to submit yourself to the Roman pontiff to be saved. They've never retracted this. Never. I have the authority of the King of Kings. I am all in all and above all, so that God himself and I, the vicar of Christ, have but one consistory, one church council. And I am able to do almost all that God can do. What therefore can you make of me but God? Wow. This is on the Vatican website. I'm not making this up. Yes, Anna. Let me take a break. I need to calm down a little bit here.
I heard at some point that vicar means equal to. Is that correct?
So the vicar, the word, it means an advocate for. It means an advocate. So even Anglicans would use the term vicar. So I don't use it because I guess partly it's not part of our tradition, but that's what it would be. The advocate for, the representative of. That's the idea behind the vicar or the vicar of Christ. Now this is later, but let me just give you a couple of other papal proclamations. Here's one in 1849. Pope Pius IX said, I alone am the successor of the apostles, the vicar, there's your word, of Jesus Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in 1895, Pope Pius X, his successor, Pius IX's successor, declared, the Pope is not simply the representative of Jesus Christ. On the contrary, he is Jesus Christ himself under the veil of the flesh. Does the Pope speak? It is Jesus Christ who is speaking. Hence, when anyone speaks of the Pope, it is not necessary to examine, but to obey. That makes Protestants very feisty, doesn't it? Don't talk to me that way. Jesus can tell me that, not you. Or in this past generation, some of you might remember Pius XII, who said, recognize the Holy Catholic Roman Church to be the only true Church of Jesus Christ, outside of which neither sanctity nor salvation can be found. Yes. No, that's okay.
Although the word vicar means representative, the way they interpret that is actually being equal to. So you say, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and that he's not simply a representative, but he's Jesus himself.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church equates the Pope to Jesus.
That's right. The Catholic Church would essentially say that the Pope is Jesus Christ, his representative, speaking on behalf of Jesus on the earth now, as opposed to God's Word or the Holy Spirit. That sort of thing. Yeah. Yes, Clay.
Just curious. Obviously, they didn't say this in English, and I assume he said it in Latin.
Yeah.
So I wondered, in the Latin phrasing of I am the way, the truth, and the life, did he say it in exactly the way the Latin Vulgate translates that?
I did not look up the Latin, so I don't know. But I will find out.
I'm just wondering, just the outside chance that a little is lost in the translation.
Yeah, sure,
If he
sure.
said it in exactly the way as the Latin Vulgate.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I'll look it up. I will look it up this week. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty bad.
Well, let me put it. I'll put it to you this way. These are translations that are official Roman Catholic from sources. In other words, I didn't get this out of a Christian book that was like, can you believe the Catholics believe this? So I get these off of. I don't have the footnotes there. I have them here. Which note is that? I can tell you. That is Pope Pius. Yeah, so that comes out of a book called History of the Christian Church by a guy called Henry Charles Sheldon. So I can look it up. But that would be interesting to compare it to the Vulgate, because the Catholic Church said that Jerome's Vulgate, we're not going to have time to go into Jerome, but that was the official that is the official copy of the Bible that is authoritative for Roman Catholics. So that would be. Let me quickly give you a response in 2 minutes to just a couple of the things that we have discussed. Some responses to the rise of Rome. Number one, it's very big. It has to do with what are the keys to the kingdom. Jesus says to Peter, he says to Peter, but it's also in the presence of the disciples, I give you the keys of the kingdom, which I regret we don't have time to look at right now. But here's the question. Where Jesus says that, where in Matthew 16 does it say that Peter's apostolic keys were passed on to others? It's not there. So it's Christ who's doing the building, not Peter, okay? So Jesus promises in Matthew 16 that Jesus, by the way, says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail. Not Peter, you will build your church. But even if we concede, which I don't, but even if we concede, okay, Peter was given a specific authority from Jesus. Peter and Peter alone, not the apostles, but only Peter. There is not a hint in Jesus' words there that he's therefore also has the authority and the ability to pass them on to a successor. And I also have to point out that what did Jesus say to Peter? Like almost within the same breath after he said these words in Matthew, get behind me, Satan. Like, was he the Pope when he was called Satan by Jesus? Just checking. Secondly, in the early... wait, let me see here. I'm sorry, I got a little bit of a difference here. Well, let's jump on. Let's go to the second one. In the early church, there was no concept such as the Pope. That did not exist in the first few hundred years of the church. There were no councils between the Council of Jerusalem in 48 AD until the year 325 when Nicaea. Nicaea, by the way, was called by whom? Constantine, who was an emperor. Later, the Catholic Church says it is only if a pope calls a council that it's an official council. And yet Roman Catholics recognize the validity of Nicaea. You see, it's very messy. It's very, very messy. But in the early church, you had emerging problems church-wide that needed to be dealt with. Novationism, treatment of those who apostatized or the lapsed. Donatism, Montanism. And none of the early churches looked to Rome as the final authority. Thirdly, Ephesians. I was actually reading this in my quiet time yesterday, and I was reminded of the impact of Ephesians 2:20. Ephesians 2, Paul says this, "So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, built on the foundation of Peter." It doesn't say that. "Built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord." The foundation of the church is Jesus and the apostles. And by the way, once you lay a foundation for a building, does the foundation then work its way up as you keep adding to the building? No, you lay the foundation and then things are put on top of it. So the idea according to the Roman Catholic Church is, well, the foundation continues to be built up as the building goes up and as we add to it with the proclamations of councils, of popes, of tradition. I don't think that's biblical. Jesus also said this, we saw in John, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Again, maybe a little rebuke to us who think that maybe if we can just get enough political power, then we can change society. We have to be careful with that. That makes me very nervous. America is not a Christian nation. That might upset some of you. The foundations, there were a lot of Christian principles that went into it, and I'm thankful for that. And I do want to see that there. Well, anyway, I won't go into this whole thing, but I hope you understand. Hope you understand what I'm saying. At the end of the day, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." When we try to mix the sword of the Spirit with the sword of the state, it doesn't go well. We'll see that all throughout Christian history. We'll notice that when we look at the Crusades, where they said, well, let's just try to forcibly make people Christian. That's not what Jesus wanted for us. And then lastly, Jesus says, "Call no man father," in Matthew 23. "And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven." I do not mean the fact that the word pope, coming from the word papa, means what? Father. That's not what I'm talking about here. So, ironically, I don't mean that. What I do mean is that Jesus cautions us from elevating anybody's beliefs or opinion to the level of inviolate authority. So no pastor, no author, no friend, parent, fellow Christian. We shouldn't put anybody's particular take on something as being, this is the perfect word of God. It's not. It's not. No man, no woman is able to bear that burden. All of us are flawed. And Jesus says that you're to look to me, you are to look to your heavenly Father alone at the end of the day, and not to any person. Okay, so what we're going to do in the next class, we're going to look at we're going to move the story along into the Middle Ages. So we've gone far ahead, and we've sort of addressed this question of how the Roman Catholic Church came to hold its particular level of authority. But don't think that we're already to the Reformation. We've still got quite a bit of work to do through the Middle Ages, and we'll continue with that next week. All right, any questions at all? I welcome them. Clay, you have my word. I'm going to look that up because I hadn't thought of that, and I'm going to look that up now this week, and I want to learn for myself. So. As my real estate professor used to do, at the end of every class, he would say, "Bye-bye." Thank you all so much for coming. We'll see you all in worship in just a few minutes. Worship.